wire had already cut through the skin. That was the first thing Emile Kabagambe noticed, not the gorilla himself, not the massive frame slumped against the base of a hagania tree, but the thin line of rusted wire buried into the flesh just above the left wrist. The hand beneath it had turned a deep, angry purple, swollen to nearly twice its natural size. The fingers curled inward like something that had already begun the slow, quiet work of surrender. He had been walking the Eastern Trail for 20 minutes, moving through the familiar rhythm of a Tuesday patrol boots on wet soil, binoculars bumping against his chest, the soft static of a radio clipped to his belt when the shape at the base of the tree registered as wrong. Not a fallen branch, not a mound of decaying vegetation, something alive, but only barely, and holding itself so still against the earth that the forest had nearly swallowed it whole. Emile crouched low, instinctively, the way the old trackers had taught him when he was 22 and too eager and too loud for the mountain forests of Virunga. He set his radio down on the moss beside his knee, placed both palms flat against the ground, and just looked. 14 years he had walked these trails. 14 years through seasons of rain and silence and the kind of human conflict that left scars on the land as deep as any poacher's wire. He had seen animals in distress before infants separated from their mothers, females injured in falls, old silverbacks in their final days lying among the roots, as though returning themselves to the soil. But something about this scene held a different weight. Something in the angle of the body, in the way the gorilla's chest rose and fell with a rhythm that was too slow, too shallow, too far from the deep bellows breathing of a healthy young male. Something that made the morning go very quiet, very fast. The gorilla was young, 12 years old, perhaps 13, a blackback teetering on the edge of becoming silver, his body carrying the bulk of adulthood but his face still holding the softer lines of adolescence. His eyes were open, which was the worst part. Not closed in sleep or unconsciousness, but open and fixed on some middle distance between the fern line and the canopy, glazed with a kind of exhaustion that had moved past panic and past struggle and arrived somewhere on the other side of both. Around the snare, the ground told the story his stillness no longer could. A wide circle of torn earth, bark stripped from the tree roots in long, ragged curls, soil clawed into dark, wet grooves that spoke of hours of effort, hours of pulling and twisting and throwing his weight against a wire that would not break and a root system that would not give. He had fought with everything his body had, and at some point in the hours before dawn, he had stopped. The mist sat low across the foothills that morning, dense enough to muffle the usual orchestra of the forest, the insects, the bird call, the distant crack of bamboo bending under the weight of feeding animals. In its place was a silence that felt almost physical, as though the trees and the ferns and the wet black soil had drawn a breath and held it. Emile could hear his own pulse in his ears. He could hear the faint, wet sound of the gorilla's breathing, each inhale carrying a thin rasp that suggested fluid or swelling somewhere in the chest. He could hear, if he held himself still enough, the almost imperceptible creak of the wire shifting against the root as the gorilla's body moved with each labored breath. He reached for his radio slowly, keeping his movements small and deliberate, the way one moves in the presence of an animal that is injured and afraid and capable, even in this diminished state, of a strength that could shatter bone. He pressed the button and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, giving the coordinates, describing the snare-old steel cable, likely set months ago by poachers targeting bushmeat and long since abandoned, anchored to the haginia's root system at a depth that had held against the full desperate power of a young gorilla's body. He described the swelling in the hand, the discoloration that suggested hours without proper circulation, the shallow breathing, the mucus drying in pale streaks around the nostrils. He estimated the weight at 150 kilograms. He requested the veterinary team from the Senkwekwe Center. He said the word urgent only once, and quietly, because the forest did not need volume to understand what was happening within it. Then he set the radio back on the moss and returned his attention to the gorilla. The animal had not moved during the transmission. His eyes had not tracked the sound of Emile's voice or the faint crackle of the radio's reply. He remained exactly as he was slumped, still, breathing in that thin and threadbare way that made each inhale feel like something borrowed rather than something owned. His right hand, the uninjured one, rested palm down on the soil beside his thigh, the fingers slightly spread, the knuckles caked with dried mud from his earlier struggle. It was a hand that had peeled bamboo and gripped branches and drummed against a young chest in practice, displays that were more play than power. Now it lay motionless, as though even the undamaged parts of his body had agreed to conserve whatever was left. Emile studied the snare's anchor point. The wire disappeared into a tangle of roots at the base of the Hagania, looped twice around a primary root as thick as a man's forearm, and secured with a crude twist that suggested haste rather than skill. A poacher's snare, set low, meant for antelope or perhaps young buffalo animals that would pull forward and tighten the loop and exhaust themselves against it. A gorilla was not the intended catch. A gorilla was an accident, a wrong place and a wrong step, and the wire did not know the difference and did not care. The swelling had progressed beyond the hand now. Emile could see it creeping up the forearm, the tissue distending beneath the skin, in a way that spoke of vascular compromise, of blood pooling where it could not return, of cells beginning to die, in the quiet catastrophe that happens when circulation is stolen from living tissue. The color was wrong, not the rich dark brown of healthy gorilla skin, but something mottled, something that shifted between purple and gray in the low morning light. If the team did not arrive soon, the hand would be lost. If the hand was lost, infection would follow. And in the mountains, with no sterile facility and no controlled recovery environment, infection in a wild gorilla was a sentence written in a language that had only one ending. "I see you," Emile whispered. The words came without decision, without thought, rising from somewhere below intention. He did not say them to calm the gorilla. He did not believe the gorilla understood language or took comfort from human speech. He said them because the silence had become a living thing, pressing against his chest, and because the gorilla's open eyes deserved an answer, even if no question had been asked. The sound of his own voice, small and steady, in the enormous green quiet of the forest, was the only offering he had. The gorilla blinked. A single, slow movement of the lids, unhurried, carrying no startle and no recognition. Then his gaze returned to the middle distance, to that private space between the ferns and the mist where his attention had taken refuge. His chest rose, fell, rose again, with that thin rasp threaded through it like a wire of a different kind. Somewhere in the canopy above, a Rawenzori Turako called a single bright note that split the stillness and dissolved into the mist without echo. The sound seemed to come from very far away, as though the forest had stretched itself around this small clearing and pushed everything else to the margins. Emile settled deeper into the moss, adjusting his weight so that his knees would not cramp, so that his body would not need to shift for a long time. He did not know how long the wait would be. He did not know what would come down the trail, a team with dart rifles and wire cutters and the cold, steady expertise of people who had done this before, or simply more silence, more mist, more of the slow passage of minutes in which a young gorilla's hand continued to die while the rest of him continued, just barely, to breathe. What he knew was this: he would not leave. He would sit in the moss and the mist and the quiet, and he would stay with this animal until help arrived or until the forest decided otherwise. That was the job, not the radio calls or the coordinates or the clinical descriptions relayed in careful whispers. The job, the real one, the one no manual described and no training prepared you for, was the willingness to remain in the presence of suffering you could not fix and simply be there. Simply not look away. The mist held its shape. The gorilla breathed. And Emile Kabagambe, 14 years a ranger, sat with his back against a mossy log in the green foothills of Virunga and began the long, still work of waiting. The first sound came from the ridge above a low, resonant hum that moved through the undergrowth the way distant thunder moves through a valley, felt in the chest before it reaches the ears. Emile did not turn his head. He kept his gaze forward, his body still, his breathing measured against the slower rhythm of the gorilla's own labored inhales. But his awareness shifted upward, toward the slope where the vegetation was dense and layered and capable of hiding animals far larger than a man. A second vocalization followed, slightly higher in pitch, carrying a tremor that Emile had heard before in his years among these groups, not an alarm call, not the sharp bark of a silverback asserting territory or warning of danger, but something lower on the register of guerrilla communication. Something that lived closer to unease than to fear, closer to presence than to protest. The family group had not left. He had suspected this. A young male on the edge of maturity would not have been traveling alone. He would have been on the periphery of his natal group, shadowing the dominant silverback, testing the boundaries of independence, without yet crossing them. The snare had caught him on what was likely a routine feeding path, a trail worn into the understory by years of heavy bodies moving between bamboo stands and sleeping sites. His family would have been nearby when the wire closed around his wrist. They would have heard the struggle, the thrashing, the grunting, the terrible sound of a powerful body throwing itself against an anchor it could not break, and they would have stayed, not out of any decision that could be called choice in the human sense, but out of something deeper and older, something woven into the social architecture of their species, like mycelium through soil. Guerrilla families do not abandon their members easily. They linger, they wait. They hold their position in the forest with a patience that has no equivalent in human behavior because it requires no effort and no resolve. It simply is. The vegetation on the slope shifted in two places where no wind touched it. A branch cracked once, deliberately, the sound sharp and intentional in the way that guerrilla movement through familiar territory is always intentional. They do not stumble, they do not brush carelessly against things. When they make noise, it is because they have chosen to be heard, and the crack of that branch carried a message that Emil understood, even if he could not have translated it into words. "We are here, we have not gone," the trapped gorilla responded. It was the most movement Emil had seen from him since the radio call, a slow lifting of the head, a flaring of the nostrils that pulled forest air across the olfactory membranes with a concentration that was almost visible in its intensity. He was reading the ridge, reading the scent signatures of animals he had known since birth, parsing the chemical language of kinship and proximity that gorillas navigate with a fluency humans can only measure and never fully comprehend. His lips parted, and from deep in his chest came a sound so low it barely qualified as audible, a rumble, a vibration, more felt than heard, pushed through the throat and out into the mist like a stone dropped into still water. A contact call, not come, not help, simply "I am still here." The answer from the ridge was immediate and layered, carrying the voices of more than one animal. The matriarch, perhaps the oldest female, whose vocalizations in Emil's experience carried a particular texture, a gravity that the younger female's calls did not yet possess. Or perhaps the dominant silverback himself, the 200-kilogram anchor around which the entire group organized its days and its movements and its slow passage through the green. The sound rolled down the slope and settled into the clearing like fog, and the trapped gorilla's body seemed to release something in response, not tension exactly, but a quality of aloneness that had been present in his stillness and was now fractionally diminished. Emil checked his watch without moving his wrist more than a centimeter. 47 minutes since the call. The veterinary team would be driving the rutted track from Senkwekwe, the vehicle loaded with dart rifles and surgical kits, and the careful calculations of ketamine dosage that Dr. Nayasaba would have begun computing the moment she received his estimated weight. 90 minutes by vehicle, then another 40 on foot through terrain that did not welcome speed. The math was merciless. The math did not care about the swelling that had now visibly progressed past the gorilla's wrist and into the forearm, darkening the tissue in a gradient that moved from purple to something approaching gray, the color of circulation abandoning its post. The gorilla's breathing had changed. Not dramatically, not the sudden collapse that Emil feared and half expected, but incrementally, the way a river slows as it widens. The intervals between each rise of the chest had grown longer by perhaps a second, perhaps two, the kind of difference that would not register on a casual observation but that announced itself to a man who had been counting those intervals for nearly an hour. Each exhale carried a faint wheeze now, a thin whistle at the edges that suggested the body was beginning to work harder for the same diminishing return of oxygen. The mucus around the nostrils had thickened and dried into pale crusts that cracked with each breath and reformed in the next. A juvenile appeared on the ridge, small, perhaps 3 years old, standing upright for a moment with one hand gripping a vine and the other hanging loose at its side. Its face was round and open, tilted downward toward the clearing, with a curiosity that had not yet learned the weight of what it was observing. For a few seconds, the juvenile simply stood there, framed against the green in a posture that was almost comically human in its uprightness, its wide eyes taking in the scene below with the uncomplicated attention of an animal that does not yet understand injury or fear or the particular kind of stillness that means something has gone wrong. Then a hand reached from behind the foliage, broad, dark, unhurried, and pulled the juvenile gently backward out of sight. The matriarch, keeping her young close, keeping the perimeter intact, the vegetation closed behind them without a sound. Emile became aware of his own heartbeat, which meant the silence had crossed some threshold into the absolute. The mist had thickened rather than burned off, which was unusual for this hour, as though the morning itself had decided to hold its position rather than advance. The light that filtered through the canopy was gray and even, casting no shadows, giving the clearing the quality of a photograph taken in the moment before the shutter opens fully. Everything was visible and nothing was illuminated. The gorilla's swollen hand lay against the dark earth like something that had already been separated from the living body beside it, a thing of different color and different temperature, governed now by processes that had nothing to do with will or strength or the deep biological imperative to survive. "Stay with me," Emile said, and the words were so quiet they barely disturbed the air between his lips and the moss in front of his knees. He was not speaking to the gorilla. He was not speaking to himself. He was speaking to the space between them, to the fragile thread of minutes that stretched from this clearing to a vehicle on a rutted road, carrying a woman with steady hands and the right chemicals, and the knowledge of exactly where to place a needle in a body this large and this compromised. He was speaking to time itself, asking it to move differently, to compress the distance between now and the moment when something could be done. Then he heard it faint, filtered through layers of vegetation and distance, but unmistakable. Boots on the lower trail. The particular cadence of people moving with purpose through difficult terrain, their footfalls heavier than a ranger's because they carried equipment, their breathing audible because the slope was steep and the air was thin and the packs on their backs held the weight of intervention. Voices followed, low and professional and controlled, exchanging information in clipped phrases that Emile could not quite make out but whose tone he recognized. The tone of people who have done this before and who understand that calm is not the absence of urgency but the discipline that makes urgency useful. He exhaled. The breath came out of him in a long, unsteady release that he had not known he was holding, and his hands, which had been pressed flat against the moss for so long that the pattern of it had imprinted into his palms, trembled once and then went still. On the ridge, the family group had gone silent, their vocalizations replaced by a watchfulness that was almost tactile in its intensity. The gorilla in the clearing breathed his thin, rasping breath and did not lift his head. And the boots on the trail grew louder, closer, each step a small subtraction from the distance that still remained between this animal and the hands that might save him. Dr. Ndayisaba did not rush. She came through the last line of vegetation with her pack already unslung from one shoulder, her eyes moving across the clearing in a single practice sweep that took in the gorilla, the snare, the anchor point, the swelling, the angle of the body, and the position of Emile crouched behind his mossy log, all of it absorbed and catalogued in the space of a few seconds without a word spoken. Behind her, two field assistants moved with the quiet economy of people who understood that noise was a currency to be spent carefully in the presence of a wild animal, even one as diminished as this. They set their cases down on the soft earth, with the deliberateness of placing offerings at a threshold, each movement choreographed by repetition and respect, and then they waited for her to speak. She did not speak immediately. She crouched at the edge of the clearing, perhaps 6 meters from the gorilla, and raised her binoculars. For a full minute she studied the animal with an attention that was clinical in its precision but carried, in the stillness of her body and the steadiness of her hands, something that went beyond the professional. She studied the swelling in the hand and the progression of discoloration up the forearm. She studied the breathing, counting the intervals the way Emile had been counting them, but with the trained ear of a veterinarian who could hear in the thin rasp and the faint terminal wheeze the specific signature of respiratory compromise in a great ape. She studied the eyes, still open, still fixed on that private middle distance, and she noted the dilation of the pupils and the dryness of the conjunctiva, and the slow, heavy quality of the blinks that told her the animal was not merely exhausted, but approaching a physiological boundary beyond which the body begins to shut down its peripheral systems in order to protect the core. Then she lowered the binoculars and turned to her team. Her voice was barely above a breath, but it carried the particular authority of someone who has made decisions in exactly these conditions many times before, and who understands that clarity and calm are not opposites of urgency, but its most essential instruments. She described the darting protocol, the ketamine dose conservative, calibrated to the low end of Emil's weight estimate, because a body this compromised would metabolize the drug differently than a healthy one, and because the margin between adequate sedation and cardiac arrest in a weakened animal was narrow enough to require precision measured in milligrams rather than estimates. She described the approach angle, the injection site, left deltoid, accessible from a slightly elevated position upslope, where the natural contour of the terrain would give her a clean line without requiring her to close the distance below 4 meters. She described the timeline: 4 to 6 minutes for the drug to take full effect, another 12 to 15 for the snare removal and wound treatment. Then the reversal agent, calibrated to bring the animal back within 20 minutes, enough time for the team to withdraw completely, enough time for the family group on the ridge to descend without encountering humans in their path. She loaded the dart rifle with movements so practiced they had become a kind of muscle memory that bypassed thought entirely. The dart itself was small, absurdly small for an animal of this size, a slender projectile carrying a volume of liquid measured in cubic centimeters that would, within minutes, render 150 kilograms of muscle and bone and beating heart temporarily unconscious. She checked the pressure, checked the needle, checked the seal, then she moved into position. The approach was the most dangerous part, and she made it look like nothing at all. She moved upslope in a low crouch, placing each foot with the kind of attention that most people reserve for threading a needle, testing the ground beneath her boot before committing her weight, avoiding the dry sticks and loose stones that could betray her position with a single careless step. The gorilla's head turned fractionally as she moved not toward her, but in her general direction, tracking the disturbance in the air the way an injured animal tracks anything that enters its diminished perimeter of awareness. His nostrils flared once. His right hand pressed harder against the earth, the fingers spreading, an involuntary preparation for movement that his body could no longer execute. But there was no alarm vocalization, no charge, no display. The animal was beyond the threshold of defensive behavior, conserving what remained of his resources for the basic mechanics of drawing breath and pushing it out again. She fired from 4.5 meters. The dart struck the left shoulder with a sound like a hand clapping against wet leather, sharp, brief, absorbed immediately by the mass of muscle beneath the skin. The gorilla flinched. A single full-body tremor that traveled from the impact site down through the torso and into the legs, rippling the surface of his body the way a stone ripples the surface of still water. His head came up, briefly, the eyes widening with a flash of something that might have been pain or surprise, or simply the last flare of an autonomic response that the conscious mind no longer controlled. Then the head lowered again. The eyes resumed their unfocused gaze, and within 4 minutes, his breathing deepened, his muscles softened, and the massive frame that had held itself rigid against the pain for hours finally, slowly, released its tension into the earth beneath it. Dr. Nandayasaba waited a full additional minute before approaching. She watched the chest. She watched the eyes, which had closed now, the lids settling with the heaviness of pharmacological sleep. She watched the right hand, which had gone slack against the soil, the fingers curling gently inward in the posture of complete unconsciousness. Then she moved forward, and her team followed. From the ridge, a sound, low, sustained, vibrating at a frequency that Emil felt in his sternum before he heard it in his ears. The dominant silverback had moved closer, visible now as a dark, enormous shape among the green, half concealed by foliage but making no effort at full concealment, his broad chest turned toward the clearing, his eyes fixed on the humans kneeling beside his fallen group member. He was not charging. He was not displaying no chest beating, no vegetation tearing, none of the explosive demonstrations of power that silverbacks deploy when they perceive a direct threat. He was doing something that Emil, in 14 years, had rarely witnessed from a dominant male in the presence of humans this close to his family. He was simply standing there, watching, holding his ground with a stillness that communicated not passivity but restraint, the deliberate, effortful choice of an animal capable of tremendous violence who had, for reasons that no one in the clearing could fully understand, decided not to exercise it. The wire cutters were surgical grade, small and precise, designed for exactly this kind of work. Dr. Nayasaba positioned them beneath the cable where it had bitten deepest into the wrist, working in increments so small they were measured in millimeters, angling the blades to cut the wire without pressing against the swollen tissue beneath. The flesh around the snare had begun to necrotize, dark, cool, carrying the faintly sweet smell of tissue that has crossed the boundary between living and dead. She cleaned as she cut, flushing the wound channel with saline from a squeeze bottle, applying antibiotic paste to the exposed layers with gloved fingers that moved with a steadiness that revealed nothing of what was happening behind her eyes. Her assistant monitored the gorilla's heart rate with a portable stethoscope pressed to the broad chest, calling out the numbers in a whisper: 62, 60, 59, each one a small confirmation that the animal was holding, that the sedation was stable, that the heart beneath those massive ribs was still doing its work with the reliable, unhurried rhythm of a muscle that has beaten 2 billion times and intends to continue. The last strand of wire parted with a faint metallic whisper, and the cable fell away from the wrist, like a dead vine dropping from a branch. The hand did not change. It remained swollen, discolored, the fingers curled in their damaged posture, the tissue cool and unresponsive to touch. But the constriction was gone. The wire that had been slowly strangling the blood supply for hours, perhaps longer, perhaps since the previous evening, was no longer there, and the vascular pathways, whatever remained of them, could begin the uncertain work of reopening. Whether it would be enough, whether the hand would regain function or remain permanently damaged, whether the tissue would recover or continue its descent into necrosis, these were questions that belonged to the coming days and weeks, to the gorilla's own immune system, and to the slow, patient biology of healing that no veterinarian could control and no intervention could guarantee. Dr. Nayasaba dressed the wound with practiced care, wrapping the wrist in a light gauze that would fall away on its own within days, secured loosely enough to allow movement but firmly enough to keep the antibiotic paste in contact with the damaged tissue. She administered a long-acting antibiotic injection into the thigh muscle. She checked the pupils, the gum color, the capillary refill time. She placed her stethoscope against the chest one final time and listened not just to the heart rate, but to the quality of the heartbeat, the strength of each contraction, the subtle variations in rhythm that told her whether this animal's body was fighting or surrendering. Then she did something that was not in any protocol. She placed her hand on the gorilla's shoulder, not to examine, not to palpate or assess. She simply rested it there, her gloved palm against the warm, dark skin, feeling the rise and fall of breathing beneath her fingers, feeling the life that was still present in this body despite everything that had been done to it by a piece of wire and a careless human hand. The gorilla's chest rose against her palm and fell again, and in that rhythm was something that transcended the clinical, something that was simply one living creature acknowledging the fragility of another. "He fought hard," she said quietly, to no one in particular, and the words hung in the mist for a moment before the forest absorbed them the way it absorbs everything, without judgment, without memory, without reply. She administered the reversal agent with the same precision she had brought to every other step, a calculated dose injected into the muscle of the upper arm, designed to metabolize the ketamine in 15 to 20 minutes, bringing the animal back to consciousness gradually, gently, without the disorientation and panic that a too rapid reversal could trigger. Then she stood, and her team began to withdraw. They packed instruments into cases. They gathered wrappers and gauze packaging and the spent dart casing. They erased their presence from the clearing, with the discipline of people who understood that the forest's memory was longer than theirs, and that every trace left behind was a small betrayal of the trust they had been given by proximity to this animal. They moved back down the slope in single file, their boots finding the same paths they had used on approach, their voices silent now, their work complete. They left nothing behind but the faint smell of antiseptic, the thin line of gauze wrapped around a swollen wrist, and the barely visible impressions in the moss where their knees had been marks that the next rain would erase, returning the clearing to the forest's keeping as though nothing had happened there at all. The first sign was a twitch in the right hand, the uninjured one, a single finger curling against the soil and then releasing, as though the body were testing its own boundaries before committing to the full work of returning. Then the ears shifted, rotating fractionally toward a sound that only the gorilla's waking brain could register, something beneath the threshold of human hearing, something carried on a frequency that belonged to the forest and to the animal's own species, and to no one else. His chest rose with a deeper pull of air than any he had taken in the last hour, held it for a moment that stretched longer than the ones before it, and then released it in a long exhalation that fogged the cool ground beneath his nostrils and sent a faint ripple through the leaf litter beside his face. Emile and the team had retreated to a position 30 meters downslope, concealed behind a fallen mahogany trunk wrapped in moss and resurrection fern. Dr. Nayasaba held binoculars to her eyes and had not lowered them since the withdrawal, her attention fixed on the gorilla with the same steady, clinical focus she had maintained throughout the operation. Her two assistants crouched beside her, one monitoring a stopwatch, the other recording observations in a small waterproof notebook with handwriting so precise it looked like typed text even in the dim forest light. No one spoke. The protocol for post-reversal observation was silence and distance, and the particular kind of patience that veterinary fieldwork demands the willingness to watch a process unfold at a pace set entirely by the animal's own biology, without intervention, without encouragement, without the human impulse to help things along. The gorilla opened his eyes. For several seconds, nothing else happened. The lids lifted with the slow heaviness of a body still draped in the residue of sedation, revealing pupils that were dilated and unfocused, swimming across the visual field without settling on any fixed point. His gaze moved over the canopy, across the fern line, down to the moss beneath his face, registering each element with the blank, unprocessed quality of consciousness, returning to a brain that has been chemically silenced and is not yet certain of its own jurisdiction. Then something in the eyes sharpened, not dramatically, not all at once, but in a gradual tightening of focus that was visible even through binoculars at 30 meters. The world was reassembling itself inside his skull, piece by piece, sensation by sensation, and with it came awareness of where he was and what his body had endured, and the particular quality of pain that was waiting for him on the other side of the drug's receding tide. His right arm extended, pressing flat against the earth. The muscles of the shoulder and forearm contracted, gathering what strength remained in a body that had spent hours fighting, and more hours lying still. He pushed. His torso shifted, trembled with an effort that was visible in the shaking of his entire frame, and with a slowness that made every second feel weighted, he brought himself to a seated position, his left hand, the damaged one, cleaned and wrapped in gauze that was already beginning to darken with fluid from the wound beneath, hung at his side like something that no longer answered to the same nervous system as the rest of him. He did not look at it. He did not attempt to move it. He simply sat, breathing, his massive shoulders rising and falling with each inhale, his eyes moving across the clearing with the cautious, methodical sweep of an animal reacquainting itself with a space that has become unfamiliar through suffering. Then the ridge came alive, not with sound first, but with movement. The vegetation parted in 3 places simultaneously, the broad leaves of wild celery and the hanging curtains of moss pushed aside by bodies that moved with the careful deliberation of animals who understand terrain the way humans understand speech instinctively, fluently, without conscious effort. The matriarch appeared first, descending the slope with a gait that was unhurried but purposeful, her weight distributed across her knuckles and feet, with the practiced balance of an animal who has navigated this exact grade 1,000 times before. The juvenile clung to her back, its small face visible over her shoulder, eyes wide and round and fixed on the clearing below. Behind the matriarch came 2 younger females, moving close together, their shoulders nearly touching as they picked their way through the undergrowth. Behind them, the adolescent males, gangly and watchful, their bodies carrying the awkward proportions of animals caught between youth and maturity. They descended in a loose formation that was not quite a line and not quite a cluster, but something organic and self-organizing, each animal maintaining a distance from the others, that spoke of social bonds so deeply established they required no negotiation. And behind all of them, the dominant silverback. He came last because he chose to. His pace was the slowest, his path the most deliberate, each placement of his enormous hands against the slope carrying the full, unhurried weight of an animal who had never in his life needed to move faster than he wished to move. The silver saddle across his back caught what little light filtered through the canopy, and even at this distance, even through the mist, the sheer mass of him altered the geometry of the clearing simply by entering it. He was perhaps 200 kilograms of bone and muscle, governed by a brain that processed social information with a sophistication that primatologists were still struggling to fully map. The family group arranged themselves around the recovering gorilla in a loose semicircle that looked unplanned but almost certainly was not. The matriarch settled first, lowering herself to the ground 3 meters to his left, her juvenile sliding from her back and pressing itself against her side. The younger females sat close together on the opposite side, their bodies angled inward, their attention divided between the young male and the silverback still approaching from behind. The adolescents crouched at the edges, their weight forward on their knuckles, holding positions that could become either rest or retreat, depending on what happened next. The silverback stopped 2 meters from the young male. For a long moment, nothing moved in the clearing. The mist held its position, the forest held its breath. The two gorillas occupied the same small space of earth and air and said nothing, because gorillas do not need to speak to communicate what matters, and what mattered in this moment was presence, the sheer physical fact of one body near another, unmoving, undemanding, simply there. Then the silverback lowered himself to the ground. He did not sit facing the young male. He did not position himself in any posture that could be read as confrontation or assessment or dominance. He sat beside him, facing the same direction, his enormous shoulder nearly touching the younger animal's arm, oriented toward the same stretch of forest and the same gray light and the same quiet that filled the spaces between the trees. It was a posture that primatologists had documented but rarely witnessed in the field, a gesture of affiliation, so understated it could be missed entirely by an observer who did not understand what they were seeing. And from the silverback's chest came a sound, deep, continuous, vibrating at a frequency that traveled through the ground as much as through the air, felt in the bones of every living thing within range before it registered in the ears. A contentment vocalization. The sound that gorillas produce when the group is together and feeding is good and the forest is safe and the world, for this particular moment in this particular clearing, is not wrong. It was not a sound that should have existed in this context beside an injured animal, in the aftermath of human intervention, with the smell of antiseptic still hanging in the air. And yet there it was, rumbling out of that massive chest with the inevitability of a river resuming its course after an obstruction has been removed. The young male leaned. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, a shift of weight measured in centimeters rather than inches. His uninjured shoulder pressed against the silverback's arm and stayed there. His breathing, which had been uneven and labored since consciousness returned, began to slow. His eyes, which had been scanning the clearing with the wary vigilance of a recovering animal, settled and softened and fixed on the middle distance with a quality that was no longer pain or fear, but something closer to the particular stillness that comes when a body that has been alone in its suffering discovers that it is not alone anymore. Dr. Nayasaba lowered her binoculars. Emil, watching from behind the mahogany trunk, noticed that her hand was trembling, a fine, involuntary vibration that she controlled within seconds, but that had been, for that brief moment, entirely visible. Her face remained composed, her breathing remained even, but the tremor in her hand said what her professional discipline would not allow her voice to say, and Emile understood it because he felt the same thing moving through his own body, the same pressure behind the sternum that was not grief and not joy, but something that contained both and transcended either. "Note the time," she whispered to her assistant, and the assistant wrote it down, and nothing else was said, because there was nothing else to say, and the forest had already said it better than any of them could. 23 days later, Emile walked the eastern trail again. The rains had come and gone twice since that morning, turning the paths to channels of red mud, and then drying them into cracked ribbons that wound through the undergrowth like old scars settling into skin. The hagenia tree where the gorilla had been trapped still bore its marked stripped bark on the roots, a shallow depression where the wire anchor had been removed, but the moss had already begun, its quiet campaign of reclamation, pale green and dense, covering the torn earth with the patience of something that measures time in seasons rather than days. Within another month, the clearing would belong entirely to the forest again, and whatever had happened there would exist only in a logbook and in the memory of the man now walking past it without stopping. He found the group on the western slope, feeding in a stand of bamboo where the light came through in pale, shifting columns that gave the forest floor the quality of a cathedral built by accident. He heard them before he saw them, the crack and splinter of stalks being broken, the low grunts that accompanied each mouthful of pith, the occasional squeal of a juvenile whose ambitions exceeded its coordination. Emile settled into his observation position behind a fallen log he had used dozens of times before, raised his binoculars, and began the slow, systematic scan that was the foundation of every monitoring visit. The matriarch was there, stripping bamboo with an efficiency that 20 years of practice had refined into something approaching art. The juvenile clung close, attempting imitation with more enthusiasm than success. The younger females fed shoulder to shoulder in their habitual proximity. The adolescent males ranged along the upper slope in a loose perimeter that was not yet instinct but was already more than coincidence. And the dominant silverback rested at the center of it all, his massive frame settled into crushed vegetation, his eyes half closed, his silver saddle rising and falling with the unhurried breathing of an animal at the absolute center of his own world. Then Emile found him, slightly apart from the others, as young males often are, but not distant, not excluded. Feeding with both hands, the right moved with fluid, practiced ease. The left moved differently, stiffer, slower, the grip less precise, two fingers that did not close fully, and a scar wrapped around the wrist like a pale band drawn by something that had no interest in beauty or symmetry. He compensated without apparent frustration, bracing bamboo against his forearm when his grip faltered, finding angles and leverages that his body had invented to replace what had been taken. The hand was damaged, the hand was functional, and in the economy of survival, that distinction was the only one that mattered. Emile recorded everything: group size, coordinates, feeding behavior, the clinical description of the injured hand's condition. He noted the weather, the visibility, the time. Then, as he prepared to withdraw, the gorilla turned, not startled, not alarmed. A slow, deliberate rotation of the head, as though something quiet had suggested he look in a particular direction. His eyes found the space where Emile crouched, not the man himself, perhaps, but the shape that did not belong to the forest pattern. The gorilla looked. Emile looked back. It lasted no more than 4 seconds. There was no recognition in it, not in any way that could be measured or claimed. But there was a steadiness, a pause in which the gaze held rather than slid, rested rather than scanned. Something felt rather than understood, occupying the space between two creatures who had once shared a clearing and a silence that neither had broken. Then the gorilla turned back to his bamboo, broke a fresh stalk, braced it against his scarred wrist, continued eating. The sound of it joined the larger chorus and became indistinguishable from any other morning. Emile closed his logbook and rose slowly from behind the fallen trunk. The mist was coming in again from the east, low and patient, erasing the edges of everything it touched. Behind him, the forest folded shut, the bamboo cracked. The silverback breathed, and the young male with the pale scar fed quietly among his family, his damaged hand working its imperfect grip in the green and shifting light, asking nothing of the morning except that it continue. And it did.